I join my colleagues in welcoming you here today. Thank you so much for joining us. I also want to thank you for the work that you've done in this report. Even though we asked for it, I know that you took some time and further confirmed that it was work that was very necessary. As you can well imagine, the procurement process and processes are very complex. But I think what your report did was confirm for many of us around this table that there was misconduct in regard to some of the processes or the not following of processes as we understood it. And so I think your report has confirmed our suspicions in that regard. In your report, and I will follow up later around the task authorizations, because I think that's a very important issue. But I first want to point out that in your report you mentioned, and this is on page 18.61, you mentioned what I think is a very bizarre issue, and that is that there is no written record of GC Strategies being contacted to submit a bid for their initial ArriveCan contract. I think you say in your report, and I quote, "The only record of communication between the Crown and the supplier prior to signing of the contract was an email from the supplier with quoted rates for various IT professional resource categories." And I guess what I'm wondering is if you could tell us, does this mean that GC Strategies was directly contacted in an unofficial manner to submit a bid for ArriveCan?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So I'd be speculating if I wanted to answer your question directly. However, we did note that it was unusual that there was no correspondence on file. One of the things we've noted in this and many other practice reviews is the lack of documentation. Now, it sounds administrative in nature, but it is the bedrock of demonstrating many of the tenets of public procurement, right? How can you be fair, open, and transparent if you cannot demonstrate any of those aspects? So documentation, again, is something that you'll hear from me very many times this evening, but it's a legitimate concern, not only in ArriveCan, but in public procurement in general.
Thank you very much. So at this point, you would say it's very irregular with the amount of non-documentation that there was on this file.
I'll also add one additional characteristic. So typically when contracts are directed, as the one that you're pointing out, there is, as we mentioned in the report, less transparency around the process due to the nature of the directed process. It is, however, highly unusual to receive a proposal without any request to receive one, unless it's an unsolicited proposal, which this didn't seem to be. Derek.
And I'll just add, so the contract you were referring to was actually the second of the three non-competitive contracts issued to GC Strategies. So they would have been in CBSA doing work under an existing contract, a separate contract, at which point there was some discussion that occurred between officials at CBSA and GC Strategies that wasn't reflected in the documentation in the file.
2.5 minutes. Thank you very much. I'm sure you've been following the developments in this committee over the last number of months, but something that we have failed to get an answer on is who actually chose GC Strategies. We've, I think, been misled and perhaps even lied to when it comes to the individuals knowing who in fact chose GC Strategies. Were you ever given any indication by CBSA as to who made contact with GC Strategies and asked for them to submit a bid?
Mr. Chair, again, thank you for the question. We have no additional information to what's been discussed at this committee previously on that issue. That's unfortunately why we had to disclose the information in the manner that we did in the report.
Thank you. One last question. I'm not sure if I have any more time than that.
20.
Okay. Did you find any record highlighting that Deloitte was not being considered or had been bumped or put on a timeout when looking for a company to undertake this work?
Deloitte really didn't show up in much of the documentation in respect to the competitive contract that GC Strategies won as the only bidder. Deloitte had indicated they were going to be they were interested in bidding, but then chose not to submit the bid. And with respect to that solicitation, that's where we point to overly restrictive mandatory criteria. But there was no indication of Deloitte being like in the penalty box or anything like that, as we heard at the committee.
And with the very few seconds I have left, have you contemplated any of the bottler allegations as part of your findings here?
So, as with everyone, we were obviously an interested party watching all of the OGGO committee hearings. We did listen, obviously, to the allegations being made, and obviously took it into account in the sense that we understood them. However, they weren't incorporated directly into the report, no.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Mr. Sousa, please.
Thank you for being here today. Very much appreciate the report as an ombudsman. It's extremely helpful in terms of what you've produced, what you've reviewed, and what this committee has been trying to ascertain. The recommendations are all very reasonable and actionable. I think on the appendix of your report, on page 31, it references the various departments that are in fact implementing or in the process of implementing some of those very recommendations as they saw and as you have rightly put forward. And your findings point to concerns in regards to lapsing of the processes for handling IT services contracts. But there's no allegation, however, of corruption, as far as I can tell from what I've read, and there's certainly no suggestion that there was political interference. Some are working hard, I think, to misconstrue one of your findings, namely the 76% of the contracts examined, the resources, right? As part of the original bill, and then ultimately they used different suppliers or they were swaps, as you've cited in your opening statement. And some may try to say that means people paid under those contracts didn't actually do the work, when in fact I think that's false or categorically false, because only people who carried out the work were actually paid, right? So I just want to get clarity on this finding. Where those resources of 76% of contracts were between the time of the contract award and then the task authorization, that lapse and that. So I got three questions in particular, hoping I have time. One, this is allowed, right, under the rules for certain cases. However, the issue you seem to have brought forward, obviously, is that it's maybe happening too frequently. Is that correct?
Yes, I would indicate that 76% is much, much too frequently.
And did you find any evidence that the resources or the subcontractors were paid for work that was never performed?
No, so there is certainly some reporting happening outside of this committee, which I think I would like to clarify, hopefully in an answer that I provide. Perhaps if you allow me, I can clarify.
Absolutely.
Okay, so as we mentioned in our opening statement, this concept is called typically around procurement circles bait and switch. And it's a known occurrence. However, there is a significant problem with it. And that problem is as follows. When you're bidding, and here the selection methodology was 70-30, indicating that it was 70 technical and 30 price, meaning the technical component is incredibly important. And the technical component is built up predominantly by the resources. Right? So when they're bidding, they provide for resources that ultimately are going to receive the highest technical score possible. So they might be awarded a contract based on technical resources that never perform any work. And then, unfortunately, the way the process worked in these instances, the resources that were provided did not have to meet the same merit criteria that the original resources did. Therefore, it would have a significant impact on fairness. So while it's not the issue that's being reported outside of this committee, it's still a very significant and concerning finding.
So, as a result, PSPC is tightening the rules as you recommended, right? And to be clear, the previous rules you examined, when the substitution was made, the incoming resource had to have had the same or similar qualifications as the ones originally listed. That's correct, right?
Not exactly.
How do you mean?
So what ended up happening is the resources that were actually listed in the bid submission were never actually captured into the contract. And so the provision that applies to the exchange or replacement didn't actually have that same merit criteria.
So what controls were actually put in place to do that swap?
That's a fair question. So that's a question that we also asked ourselves. There seemed to be just a general lack of control around this swapping exercise. And so, again, I don't want to raise too many alarms, but it is a significant alarm in terms of, particularly in this instance, how the criteria were applied for other bidders.
Then the work was applied, or the contract was awarded, within the context of the TA. Is that correct?
Yeah. So again, I'll try to explain this as basically as I can, because I know that not everyone is a procurement expert, but essentially the resources that are submitted in the proposal should be carried forward into the contract and ultimately form part of subsequent TAs. Unfortunately, what happened was, in the solicitation document, the resources that were evaluated were never actually captured in the contract, and therefore when the TA was submitted, it was the supplier themselves that could ultimately replace that resource. And as opposed to having to meet the criteria that they met with the original resources bid, they were just required to meet the minimum, right? The mandatory criteria plus the rated criteria minimums. Again, I know this is a bit difficult to understand, but it is a significant issue.
Did you see any nefarious activity happening here?
I wouldn't describe it as nefarious, but I would say that the frequency was concerning.
Was it as a result of the period of time during COVID?
Again, I don't want to downplay the fact that this was during the pandemic, and obviously was a very different time. So I know we're now outside the pandemic, so it's very easy to have a retrospective lens and apply it in that way. I will say, though, that number is still exceptionally high, even in that circumstance.
Yeah, we agree.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mrs. McNulty, please, for 6.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. Mr. Yeglik, Mr. Merceau, thank you very much for being with us here today. We were just now talking about the technical process that helped 75% of IT specialists who actually didn't end up working, who were replaced. Were they switched out by an equivalent person, or was it impossible to determine whether or not that was the case?
Definitively, in all instances, the status of the replacements, but I think, Derek, perhaps you can better answer this, but I would say in many instances they were not equivalent.
Yeah. For the most part, everyone who worked on the contracts met the minimum requirements that were set. So when they have criteria associated with the individuals or the resources who do the work, they have to meet all what are referred to as the mandatory criteria, the must pass, as well with the point rated criteria. There's a minimum score. So everyone who we saw records of there being evaluations, because there were some missing documentation, but everyone who was evaluated met the minimum standard. But what happens in these situations is that the individuals who are put forward to win the contract are essentially the best resources possible. And then later on, the ones who are bid, you could still have some good quality resources, but they're not the absolute best, because there's no longer that competitive nature.
Et est-ce que c'est quelque chose?
And, well, 75% of the time this occurred in this particular case, but generally speaking, when it comes to other contracting, is that frequent that we'd see such a high rate of professionals who, at the end of the day, actually didn't work as part of that contract? I get the sense what you see on the internet, there are clickbait ads. And I get the sense that these professionals were used as clickbaits of some sort in order to get contracts valued at hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. Is this a common practice in the contracting process, or is this specific to your actual situation under review?
Directly as possible. Because we have not reviewed this specific issue more broadly, I would be speculating, but it is an issue that we've heard about, and so I would say it happens. I can't say if 76% is higher than normal, but it is an issue, right? And so that's where I am very happy that the committee has raised this, because I think this is an issue that needs to be rectified. And as the previous member mentioned, it's been brought to the attention of the department and they've been seized by this, so I anticipate a very positive reaction.
And if I could just add that in the response to the report, a PSPC procurement, they said that that was an existing concern that they had already had, and essentially the results of this study were validating their concerns, and they really want to avoid, or they're going to promote not using criteria associated with the individuals if they're not going to be named in the contract, because that would actually take away the incentive to put forward high-quality individuals who never are given the opportunity to work on the contract.
Est-ce qu'il est déjà arrivé que...
Has it previously occurred that Shared Services Canada or Procurement Canada has said, listen, you've switched out most of the specialists on the basis of which we actually awarded you this contract, and now you're going to lose that contract? Has that previously occurred? Has it gotten to that point where we're asking for frankness and the truth, and that's not what we got? Has that previously occurred?
Speculate, so I can't directly answer, but I would say that it's something I'm sure causes a great deal of frustration within the departments themselves as well.
Merci.
Thank you. Now, a slightly easier question. Is it normal that the federal government would impose a knowledge of French on all employees working in that contract? That might have an adverse effect on individuals or a company that is able to code, that's able to do IT work, but whose employees don't speak French. Is this normal that this would be an imposition in a bilingual country?
Good question. I think from a technical standpoint, I know I've heard many IT professionals speaking about the lack of resources. I don't want to speculate why that was done. I'm not an IT expert, but I do think in a bilingual country, it would be important to also perhaps include French resources.
Je vais les prendre.
Well, I'll take them. No, certainly not. Is it normal, in your opinion, that a company comprised of two individuals, only two individuals, would get an $11 million contract when they haven't even filled out the proper paperwork and the staff were not those who were expected to work on the contract? Is this normal, and what can we do to address this going forward?
What I will say is I think what the committee hearings have also done is exemplified the complexity associated with federal government procurement. And you have organizations who exist to help suppliers bid on contracts. That is a practice ultimately that costs the taxpayer money. And it comes at a consequence. So I know that wasn't directly your question, but I will say that I think shining a light on this issue will perhaps cause government officials to act differently when considering strategies in how to procure goods.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bachrach, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here. I want to extend our gratitude for your work and your report. It was my colleague, Gord Johns, who brought forward the original motion to study this matter, and I want to thank our colleagues around the table for supporting that. I think this is an issue should be an issue of great concern to all Canadians, and the revelations that you've highlighted in your report point to a lot of concerns. I'm new to this study. I wasn't privy to all the testimony prior to this about ArriveCan, but I thought I would start sort of at the 10,000-foot level and ask you, in your opinion, having looked at this procurement process, in your opinion, how concerned should Canadians be about the way that ArriveCan was procured?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So I do think how I answered a previous question about the emergency context is an important kind of umbrella to remember, right? So ArriveCan was put together during a very difficult time in Canada's history and the world's history. That being said, there are certainly best practices in emergency procurement, and many of those were not followed. And the best example I can give, and I know I said I'm going to talk about this very often, and I will, is documentation. Yes, decisions were required in a very, very brief amount of time, but that does not mean that documentation should not exist on those decisions. And so it's very difficult to determine that something is done fairly, and then therefore raising suspicions as to whether it was not done fairly when documentation doesn't exist. So one of the biggest issues that I found with all of the ArriveCan documentation that we reviewed was the sheer lack of documentation in many instances. That being said, one excellent practice that we did see is in an emergency procurement, one of the best practices that one can do is actually go to existing suppliers who are known commodities, who have been qualified, as opposed to going to new suppliers that you have no pre-existing history with. And that's because they've already been vetted. So it removes some of the concerns associated with emergency procurement. But to directly answer your question, yes, I was concerned by the findings, and I think the recommendations reflect that concern. And I believe that the report is very factually accurate and devoid of any inflation.
The question was whether Canadians should be concerned, but I take it if you're concerned, Canadians should also be concerned, given your expertise in these areas. And I appreciate the emergency nature of the procurement, but some of the things that you've highlighted seem like schemes that have been developed over, like these didn't just all of a sudden arrive out of the blue when the pandemic hit. You talked about the bait and switch scheme. You talk about these organizations that exist solely to help suppliers, get through the government's contracting system, the procurement system. Are these systemic issues that run throughout federal government procurement, or are these issues that you've highlighted today specific to the ArriveCan procurement?
So they're systemic to ArriveCan. Like I answered previously, I can't say they're systemic because we haven't done the review. So for example, the reference to bait and switch, we've not looked at bait and switch across all government departments for me to answer this is absolutely systemic across other departments and agencies. That being said,
but like it's common enough that it has a catchy name. Like this can't. I guess what I'm asking. Bait and switch can't be specific to ArriveCan. This is something more systemic throughout procurement.
Absolutely. So I would agree with that characterization. I do have to be careful, obviously, because I should only be factual in nature. Where I've done a review, I can give you specific details, specific statistics. I can't give you statistics saying this is higher than normal. But what I can say is, even without a baseline figure, this number is very concerning.
I noted your discussion about the use of median bands to disqualify bids that were either very high or very low. And you noted that the way that the median bands were set up really favored higher bids than lower ones. Does this, by extension, can we infer that the government paid more for the ArriveCan app than they otherwise could have?
So yes, I would agree with that characterization that the bans did have a negative impact on the price paid, meaning higher prices were probably paid than necessary. And again, I think one of the distinctions that one can draw is the traditional band is the median plus 30 and median minus 20, meaning that prices within that range are acceptable. In this situation, it was done differently, right? And there was no justification provided, and that's why you saw the recommendation you did in this area.
What's the justification, out of curiosity, for an asymmetrical median band?
And again, I wish I could give you one. We were looking for one to better understand, and none was provided.
So, a similar question, based on the issue with resource swapping, where, let's say, less qualified resources ended up working on the project. You thought you were getting the all-star lineup, and instead you got sort of the third string. What's the likelihood that at the end of the day, the product that the government procured was of a lower quality than one that might have been otherwise created had these companies actually provided the resources they said they were going to provide at the initial stage?
Just a very brief answer, please.
Absolutely. And you've put your finger right on the issue around best value. In both the technical and the price component, there were impediments to seeing the best outcome. So I think you very nicely summarized the issue in both areas.
So, Mr. Chair, we overpaid and we got a product that wasn't as good as it should have been. I think that's the sum of the story.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Kusi, please, for 5.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I'm going to continue with this theme of bait and switch. And of course, for clarification, this is where a vendor provides a proposal with specific contractors, is awarded the contract, and then after being awarded the contract, uses other individuals not specified within the proposal that was submitted and that the contract was awarded on to complete the work. And as you pointed out in your report, 76% of the contracts did no actual, 76% of the 76% of the contracts, the resources proposed to work on the contract did no actual work on the contract. Do you see this as a form of fraud on behalf of the vendor that submitted the proposal?
So because this is actually a contemplated occurrence, it's the frequency with which that makes it so concerning, right? So the replacement of individuals is something that likely is to happen. And as another committee member rightly pointed out, it was, or some of this was happening during the time of the pandemic. But that being said, the systematic nature and the frequency that this was occurring was much higher. So it's the systematic non-compliance that becomes troubling.
And do you believe, after seeing this occur in 76% of the contracts that were awarded, that there should be a system in place to immediately suspend contracting with the company? Because we did see with this government that they had indicated that they were suspending operations across the government with this vendor and then later seemed to withdraw that. What are your thoughts on that, please?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. Again, my role is to make recommendations to the departments themselves. In terms of an outcome for a specific supplier, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment because, again, that wasn't the nature of this review.
But system-wide, having seen this in this specific case, would you make that recommendation?
I would not. I have not, so I can't say I would have.
Okay.
Yeah.
This was alluded to earlier. There is now evidence that the chief information officer at the time, Min Do-han, who has appeared before this committee and who we are attempting to get back, deleted emails in regards to the procurement of this app. And although the reasoning behind it is not clear, he tried to explain publicly to the press, or I should say the press garnered information that he attempted to explain that was in the transfer of files from his laptop to a new system. But do you think this deletion of information could have possibly led to the incomplete information record that we have at this time?
Can't speculate specifically on the issue that you presented, though I will say that it is highly problematic in terms of the void of documentation. Now, I wouldn't suggest that one individual deleted all of the records that we didn't receive. However, obviously, if there was a true deletion, the impact would be very significant.
Is there currently no system in place to ensure that all communications are automatically uploaded and saved? There's the saying, something on the internet never goes away, lives on forever. Is this not the same with the Government of Canada and our systems?
So you'll see in the report, we do note a good practice around communications where there is an electronic database, and there are other electronic databases referenced. However, this is a systemic issue. The one reason why you didn't see a document retention style recommendation coming from us out of this report is because we've actually done previous reviews of both of these departments and found documentation deficiencies. So we've made that recommendation already, albeit we now have to follow up with those departments to ensure that documentation practices have in fact improved.
A recommendation clearly that this government did not listen to and attempt to fix. My last question is, GC Strategies won a $25.3 million contract in May of 2022. Is it correct that GC Strategies was the only one who could win the contract because the mandatory criteria required the winning bidder to have worked on 3 contracts the CBSA had previously sole sourced to GC Strategies? And can this contract still be considered to be competitive when the criteria is so restrictive?
So as we noted in the report, absolutely the criteria were identified to be very restrictive in nature. And as we mentioned in the report, it was highly unlikely that any other participant in the process could have been the successful bidder other than GC Strategies, because as we noted in the report, they heavily relied on the 3 sole source contracts that they had provided to CBSA as justification for complying with the mandatories. And when you look at the uniqueness of the mandatories, that's why we were able to say on its face that these mandatories were overly restrictive. In terms of your second question, could we say that this was still competed? It was competed. However, these mandatories made it very difficult for any other participant to participate in that process.
Thank you to our witnesses, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Jouari, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Mr. Jegleg. It's good to see you here, and thank you for the work you've done. Looks like over the Christmas to be able to, and New Year to be able to put this report. Solid recommendation, and I think the way you characterized the report and the work that you've done was a fair statement. That it was factual, it was balanced, and it was recommendations. During the course of at least last 10 or 20 minutes, there's been a lot of responses, and I just wanted to get one thing clear starting. Did any money paid for any work that was not done? Put the whole bait and switch and all of those things done, but was there any money gone to any contractor or any company for a work that was not done?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So I can't speak again to the payment. We did not look at whether payment was in fact made, so I cannot answer.
Okay, no worries. Are you aware whether CBSA has accepted or rejected the recommendations that you've made?
So it's actually in the annex of the report. You'll see that CBSA has in fact accepted the recommendations in the report and have been quite forthcoming in their action plan in terms of what they're going to do to implement change.
Yeah, great. So my understanding, very much like yours, is that CBSA has already accepted all the recommendations, and a lot of the work on implementing those recommendations has already started. Also from the scope of the work that CBSA on the review of these contracts is done, do you know whether it was limited to any type of services, or the stop and review was for all contracts, for all the services?
Unfortunately, I'm also not clear on the question.
Yeah, well, the key thing is CBSA not only stopped all the contracts for IT, it stopped all the contracts and they put it under review. Right. So they've gone above and beyond. Can you confirm that?
I cannot confirm that, but
okay.
I would suggest you would ask that directly to CBSA.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go back to the concept of bait and switch. And I come from a management consulting background. I'm very familiar with the bait and switch. Not that I've ever practiced it, or the company, the organization that I work with practiced it. But I want to bring a perspective that I'd like your feedback on. Traditionally, when you look at a very valuable contract, naturally you put your A team forward. And it is the A team that does the presentation, but also understand that A team is part of the very scarce set of resources. And if the client takes longer than anticipated to be able to make that decision, often both the company, the consulting firm, as well as the client are put in a position that, given the length of time that is taken to be able to come up with a final decision, those resources might not be available. I can tell you on a number of projects, I did the presentation, I was there, and I had to go to another client because the existing client was taking way too long. I'm not taking in any way the great work that you've done and the fact that this practice exists, but did you, during your process review, look at any type of timeline that this happened, or you just focused on the frequency of it?
If I could respond. We did look at timeline, but more importantly, we saw zero evidence of any indication that there was a discussion around changing of resources that weren't in the bid, like an explanation on why someone might be available. We were looking for any evidence that would show that the name of the individual who was initially proposed is no longer available for whatever reason, but there was just nothing. There was zero emails back and forth between the technical authority of the business owner at CBSA and the supplier themselves.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to make sure that that point is kind of tabled and is also removed from the discussion, because that could that could provide an opportunity for companies to come back and say, hey, look, it took too long, therefore we had to switch. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, and I'm very happy you clarified right away that wasn't your practice when you were a consultant. We'll go to you, Mrs. Vignola, for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. In your report, I observe, well, you wrote that oftentimes research outcomes and findings were lacking when it came to the bidders. I won't go into detail on that, but is that something that's also quite frequent? We're talking about 14 files that didn't include research results. In other cases, there were incomplete results. Sometimes they were completely absent. Is that normal?
Normal, but it is something that we've seen with some level of frequency, right? But again, back to my earlier statement about it's impossible to demonstrate fairness if you do not have records demonstrating how you evaluated all of the bids. So when you lack the consensus evaluation of a specific bid or all specific bids, I'm not sure how you would then argue that you've done things appropriately, right? And that has been our issue in writing this report, is that when there's a lack of documentation, it's getting more and more difficult not to make negative inferences from the lack of documentation.
J'ai été enseignante, notamment.
I was a teacher in intellectual work methodology, and what you have underscored in your work, had I had to assess one of my students who'd made such omissions, well, their grades wouldn't be really very good at all, quite poor, in fact. So how can we ensure that officials and public servants are complete and sound in their work methodology?
Providing evaluators guidance. So as you can appreciate, not every evaluator who's a participant in the process is experienced, and so therefore they require guidance in terms of what guiding lights should ultimately inform their work. Evaluators play an incredibly important role in the process, and so therefore without that existing documentation and also training as to how to perform evaluations, it's really not fair to the evaluators to expect them to understand how to evaluate appropriately. And that's something I think we see across government, is it's very inconsistent. Some departments do it much better than others.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Mr. McRae, please, for 2.5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the contracts with GC Strategies identified in the report, valued at $13.9 million, was awarded under the national security exemption, requiring the company to have what's called designated organization screening with approved document safeguarding at the level of protected B. Now, I don't know what all that means, but it sounds like it's a level of security clearance that's required for them to have the contract. Now, in your report, you say that GC Strategies did not meet this requirement when it was awarded the contract, and then 14 months later, they changed the requirements of the contract, and all of a sudden they did meet the requirements. Now, there's 14 months that go by where you have a contractor that doesn't meet the security requirements of a contract. What kind of documentation did they have access to during those 14 months? And what level of risk did it place our country in, having a contractor that was not properly screened, working on, a IT project that obviously is an important one and involves all sorts of classified information? What's the level of risk there?
So again, I have to confess that I also am not a security expert, but I would suggest that it would seem that they would have access to documentation up to the protected B level. That being said, I don't know, Derek, if you saw any documentation specific on exactly what type of documentation they may have had access to.
No, this may be one of the very few instances where you have GC Strategies as being just two individuals who never did any of the work, because they weren't doing any of the IT work themselves. So out of when they're operating the business out of their home, we don't know specifically what documents.
There's no risk to security because they actually didn't do anything. Is that what I'm taking from your answer? The safest contractor is one who doesn't do any of the actual work.
Presumably, they would have been handling invoicing documents and that sort of thing administratively, but because they didn't do any of the work, they wouldn't have.
They were processing the payments and putting them in their bank account, but they weren't actually likely to be accessing documents that were of a national security nature, if I can paraphrase.
As I understand it, the two individuals who run GC Strategies are not IT experts.
Did you find? I'm sorry, that is our time.
Thanks, Mr.
Thanks
Chair.
very much. Mr. Generous, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm so grateful that we have here today the watchdog responsible for government contracting, and thank you for producing an excellent report on the ArriveCan scandal. I'm a father of 5 children, and I've changed a lot of diapers over the years, and none of them stink as much as the contracting system that you're describing in this report. I want to start with the issue of minimum prices. When Canadians are trying to buy things, they try to find the best price that they can without compromising quality. Right now, so many Canadians are struggling and working overtime to hunt for those low prices. But paragraph 24 to 28 of your report describe a system for government purchasing that incredibly is intentionally designed to reward more costly bids and cut out lower bids. We have a procurement system that is designed to penalize the businesses that offer government lower prices. Not by accident, it's how the system is designed. You say, quote, this methodology disincentivizes bidders from proposing lower rates, end quote. To create a process that directly punishes suppliers for offering low prices suggests that the person designing the system is either completely insane or is intentionally looking for opportunities to funnel as much money to a preferred supplier as possible. Is there any possible justification for this system being designed this way?
Yeah, and thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a fair question, and I think the answer lies in perhaps it was an attempt to address another known failing. So in examples where there's a low bidder who bids so low that they can't actually perform the work, but they need to ultimately have an opportunity to provide government services so that they can build up their resume and ultimately have experiences in subsequent opportunities, they bid below profit margins, right? So as a result, I think what's happened to the government in many, many instances is that supplier is not able to ultimately fulfill the services because it's no longer profitable for them. Or alternatively, they decline the work. So they've been awarded the contract based on the price, and when it comes time to delivering on the work, they don't do the work. So there's a significant amount of time lost. To address your question in terms of the price bands, though, I think what happened here is there was a deviation in the price band. And so as a result of the deviation, a clause that should have affected the ability to justify a low price wasn't available.
Can I just dig in on that? The system you're describing, though, is based on something in relation to median price. It's not based on any objective evaluation of, in some cases you could say this is obviously a price that's suspiciously low for whatever reason. You can imagine that happens. But if it's based on median price, then if I'm bidding, I have to worry about and it's within the narrow band you described. I have to worry that if I offer the best price and it happens to be just a little bit lower than what everybody else is offering, then I'm going to be penalized for being able to provide the best product at the lowest price. So I have to be increasing my price in order to ensure that I don't fall below. And I have no awareness of what prices the other suppliers are putting in. That creates a system, since it's based on median price, in which everybody is going to be bidding higher than they would otherwise because they're afraid of falling below. right? So if you have 5 people bidding and you want to make sure you're not too far below where everybody else is, then you're gonna bid higher. But basic economics tells us that everybody is then going to be driving up the price of the bid. So that's just going to exert significant continuous upward pressure on the price. Given how this is designed, like, it seems so obviously crazy, and it seems like it's an excuse, not a reason. That there would be plenty of other ways of solving for the problem that you've suggested.
So I won't disagree with your characterization, because fundamentally that's also how we saw this issue. The only thing I will say, to be fair, is if the price support clause works effectively, it does allow a low bidder to ultimately then be accepted, right? So what it requires them to do is provide invoices on previous contracts or to other clients demonstrating that they've been able to fulfill the work at that lower price point, and then that price would be accepted. Right. But I would agree with your characterization of it's still risky.
Right. Yeah, thank you. So who are the people who designed this crazy system? We've asked who made the decision to award the contract, but who is responsible for creating this system as it was?
Very briefly, please.
So I have no direct knowledge as to who would have designed this medium bands process.
Which department?
Probably Public Services and Procurement Canada, I think, is likely the originator.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kuzmierczak, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Yeglich, for being here today, and Mr. Mesereau as well. Thank you very much. As I understand it, this was a year-long analysis of ArriveCan. Can you tell us how often do you do these sorts of deep dives into one procurement project? Just curious.
So over the last 5 years, we've done 19 systemic reviews, now with this one 20, to give you a sense. And we had a pretty static 5-year program where we were looking at the top 17 departments in terms of value and volume, and looking at 3 static lines of inquiry to be able to assess, kind of almost create baseline data. And so now that we've created that baseline data, it's a really important launch pad for us to know where to look next. ArriveCan was a bit of an anomaly. It was brought to us by the committee, but ultimately we were able to find reasonable grounds to launch, and so as a result we were able to do this review. And there's another review also coming as a result of this committee's action on McKinsey.
And you said 19 over the course of how much time?
5 years.
Oh, over 5 years, yeah? Okay. And when you do those reviews, I mean, do you look at like departments or management teams, for example, or do you look at specific procurements where it's one file, one procurement? Just curious, what do you look at? I'm just curious when you do these audits.
So the way it was done during the last 5 years was it was department by department. So it was static lines of inquiry across 17 different departments.
Okay, gotcha. So this is kind of unique a little bit.
So absolutely, we've done a few that I would describe as ad hoc, so they weren't part of our systemic plans. That being said, our bandwidth is limited, right? And again, I don't want to make a plea to this committee, but I will say there's a lot of important work that needs to be done, and I'm not sure that I have the resources to do that work. So thankfully, to do this work and the work of McKinsey, we were granted the funds to do so. But now in future years, as we plan for new procurement practice reviews and other areas where we think we could highly be beneficial to the procurement landscape, I'm not sure that we have the resources to do so.
Thank you. There's a lot of eyes on this issue. This particular issue. There's a lot of scrutiny on this issue. You have an Auditor General report. You have, obviously, the Procurement Ombudsman report that you've submitted. CBSA is doing their internal audit. RCMP is investigating a related issue. And then, of course, you've got the OGGO committee here looking at this issue. A lot of eyes on this particular issue. Can you talk a little bit about your experience working with CBSA, which is the subject of, and PSPC, which are the subjects of this review, and shared services as well, too. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience over the last year? How forthcoming have they been in terms of information provided? and in terms of making your work go more smoothly. Can you speak a little bit about your engagement?
Sure. So I'll let Derek answer the second part of this. I just wanted to say that we do follow a pretty standardized process when it comes to these reviews. So those departments that were subject to the review would have been provided preliminary observations, at which point they would have been given an opportunity to speak to any observations that we had seen based on a file-by-file analysis. After receiving any additional documentations, corrections, etc., we would then go to that first draft, and we would provide them a first draft of the report with a 20 working day review period, so they could then analyze the text of the draft, and they could provide, again, additional feedback, precisions. And again, that's where we want to land, is a factually accurate position. So if there are additional documents that you can provide, which did happen in many instances, then we would take those into consideration prior to finalizing the report. And then there's a final 10-day review period. And so there would have been interactions between ourselves and the departments who were subjected to the review during those touch points. Derek was the one who really managed the relationship, so I'll let him speak to how cordial or not those relationships were.
Early in the process, we wrote, Alexander wrote to the deputy heads of those departments, and they identified a point of contact, usually a member of their senior management team. And then we held initial meetings with them, what we refer to as our kickoff meetings. And from there, we extended our document request. For each of the departments, I will say that we've received good support from each of the three that were involved in this particular review. We had some back and forth, of course, because they provide initial documents. Oftentimes we'd have questions about them. They were quite responsive in providing those responses. And that was through the early stages. And then as the procurement ombudsman was just describing, as we got to the stages later in the review when we had results, we would have meetings with them if they had questions about the preliminary observations, and they would provide the responses to which we considered as we were developing the draft report, which eventually led to the final report that the committee received.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Mrs. Block.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I want to go back to my original question regarding the lack of documentation and sort of bring that together with what my colleague raised in regards to the Globe and Mail article regarding Canada's Chief Technology Officer. With this finding, paired together with the allegations published last week, that an IT specialist at CBSA is accusing a VP of erasing data. Is it possible that data relating to the initial request for a bid may have been erased as well? And are you concerned at all that this is the case, that there is missing documentation and we have now these allegations of someone deliberately doing that?
So obviously the allegations are very concerning, particularly from a procurement standpoint. You will have noticed in our annual report, one of the things we identify is we don't have the right to compel documentation. And it's a particular frustration point for me, and I have to admit, when I watch these committee proceedings, I'm a bit envious of how you compel documentation. I would describe the authorities that we have as less than a Canadian citizen, because if I make an access to information request, at least it's protected under the Access to Information Act, and there are specific guidelines that need to be followed. With our request, there are no such guidelines, so we're acting on the goodwill of the parties to provide us the documentation. So where there is a lack of documentation, I'm never 100% clear whether it's the result of our inability to compel documentation, whether it's a purposeful exclusion, or otherwise, right? And that's where I said, at what point do we start making negative inferences and stop just talking about documentation? And like I said, you'll hear documentation come up several times this evening because it is one of the largest irritants that I have currently, not just in ArriveCan, but in general, in order to perform the work that we need to do.
Okay, thank you very much. Going back to the 76% of the listed resources in successful bids that did no work on the ArriveCan contracts, I'm thinking that this means that companies were winning bids based on the resources or subcontractors that they claimed would provide if they won the contract. And then when the time came to do the work, the companies that won switched their subcontractors. So my question in regards to that is, when these switches occurred, were there ever any reassessments of capabilities of the new resources or a renegotiation of the prices based on different resources? Is there any documentation to that? And I guess, was there ever a change in price when resources were substituted?
Thank you. I'll let Derek answer this one.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And there is a process set up, and that's through the task authorization process. So under these professional services contracts, as we stated earlier, no one was actually named in the contract. So anyone who was included in the bid wasn't named directly in the contract. They were only authorized to perform the work once they were added to a task authorization. So anyone who wasn't previously evaluated as part of the bid evaluation would have had to have been evaluated at the time that the task authorization was issued. So whenever we saw the documents, there were some missing. When those documents were on file, we were able to identify that, yes, the individuals that were put forward as replacements for those who were included in the bid, they met the minimum requirements for those positions. There was no renegotiation of rates, to answer your other question.
So with that answer, it is possible to conclude that potentially the vendors brought in resources that may not have cost them as much and therefore received a greater profit on the project.
That's a possibility. We don't have any information with that respect, though.
Thank you.
30 seconds.
I'm done.
Great.
Thank you.
Mr. Baines, over to you, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our guests for joining us today. And you know, I'm always surprised at how much I learn. And I know our chair calls this the mighty OGGO. So we learn a lot here about our systems and the many layers that are, I believe. I just want to go on that sort of same line of questioning just to sort of understand a little bit more. You said like the practice of the swapping, commonly known around procurement practice, like, and it's obviously systemic. And like, do you know like how long this has been going on to the point where do you believe like this has become like a normalized practice where like certain people outside of the departments are being relied upon to do some work, like headhunt for them and find these things, and again, it's become a normalized practice.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would not want to say it's a normalized practice. I would say it definitely occurs. I would agree with the characterization that it's systemic. Like I said in a previous answer, I can't comment as to whether what we saw in ArriveCan is better or worse than what we typically see. It is certainly filling my head with ideas in terms of a potential secondary review associated with this issue to be able to better answer these questions. But again, I don't want to say it's normalized because...
Would that be a recommendation, you know, moving forward, like to actually look at this particular occurrence and review that specific practice? And that sort of comes to my next question is like, how do we fix that?
And as you heard in my opening comments, Mr. Chair, in order for me to launch a review, I need reasonable grounds to do so. So this is a perfect gateway to create reasonable grounds because now we've seen the issue, we've known about the issue, and so we were able to make recommendations to help remediate. But that being said, I do think it does speak to reasonable grounds. The cautionary tale here is I also have to tie this to a part of my previous answer which spoke to funding. In order to be able to pursue many systemic reviews, I do think that will require additional funding for the foreseeable future.
And then to the band, the issue of the band, the median pricing, we were unable to, I think, in previous questions, determine like how long this has been, that system's been in place. Like, did we come to that point from like a trial and error? Or are you aware of like how we reached this specific part?
So I don't have the history. I'm not sure, Derek, if you have any additional history. This was our first kind of vantage point of the bans. But like I said in the previous answer, we had a similar reaction that it didn't seem logical. And then I think the changes to the ban structure weren't justified. So as a result, some of the provisions that were meant to capture a price substantiation for lower weren't actually triggered because of the change.
And if I could just add that in addition to that, PSPC informed us that when they've tried to use that clause as it exists currently in the past, it's been ineffective at trying to determine whether or not the supplier was able to fulfill the contract with the lower rates that they have provided. So that led to our recommendation around correcting that clause so that they had a mechanism that would be effective to validate lower rates when they were lower than the median band rates that are proposed by the suppliers.
Do you have any recommendations on how government practices could be more accessible to small and medium-sized Canadian entrepreneurs? I think, in a way, that we've sort of see how that system could push others out. And we were seeing some cracks in that ultimately. So people who have valuable products, services, and that could help government innovate and find more efficiencies ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gives me pleasure to be able to refer back to work that the committee has done. And I know there's at least 2 committee members who were involved in the review in 2018. But it was exactly that. It was work that was done as to recommendations made by this committee as to how to improve the procurement system to allow for greater participation of small and medium-sized business, women-owned business, and Indigenous business. So one of my suggestions would be to ensure follow-up on those recommendations. So I actually reviewed many of those recommendations last night in preparation for this, but it might be an opportunity for the committee to revisit the recommendations made in 2018.
And you looked at...
that is our time, I'm afraid.
Okay, good.
Mrs. McNulty, please, for 2.5.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. I find it extraordinary that during the pandemic we were told how important it was to have personal protective equipment that was affordable, and that the only equipment that was affordable was from China. And now we realize essentially that this whole median issue meant that we didn't get the best price, but in fact the highest price. And yet in the pandemic, there were Canadian companies that could have provided us with this equipment, but it was considered too expensive. It's a wicked, bizarre, circuitous logic. I can't wrap my head around it. Now, if I could come back to the criteria, in your report you specified that there were overly restrictive criteria. So here's my question. When there are overly restrictive criteria, is that a way of awarding a contract without really going through a proper solicitation process? It was supposed to be a proper solicitation process. Is it 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, or what do you make of it?
The characterization that when you do restrict the criteria in the way that they were, it makes it almost impossible, as we reflected in the report, for any other bidder to participate in the process. So as a byproduct, I would describe these criteria as so restrictive that the winning bidder was likely the only bidder who could participate.
Votre rapport indique...
Your report indicates that the Canada Border Services Agency didn't proactively disclose the contractual arrangements for a number of contracts. And we got a summary of the contracts, and there were 25 contractual instruments. So why is there this discrepancy between what you've gotten and what we got? Did the CBSA explain why certain contracts weren't published?
I'm not sure if you have an answer on proactive disclosure.
We did not get an explanation on why they weren't published. just that they weren't. And we saw this, it's not unique to CBSA. We've seen this in other departments in some of the past reviews that the Procurement Ombudsman was talking about, where there have been issues with information that was available through proactive disclosure. And actually, in this one in particular, the first time we tried to find these contracts, we found almost nothing. And that's reflected in the report where we say the contract numbers themselves were wrong. So we went back to the files and cross-referenced them with a database that you can download from this. But if you're an average Canadian and you're trying to get information off the system about contracts that were awarded, you'd be really hard-pressed to find any useful information, or very little anyway.
Thank you for that. I'll have to cut you off there because we're past our time. Mr. Bachrach, please go ahead for 2.5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to speak briefly to the longer-term picture here, because we have CBSA and PSPC that have committed to a series of changes. Because it's PSPC, presumably those changes would affect procurement across government. But there's a question of how we confirm that these changes are actually made, that they're sufficient, and that they have the effect that they're intended to have. What are your recommendations in terms of ensuring that these issues get dealt with? Is there a need for a follow-up audit to confirm that the problems that you've identified in your report have been properly addressed?
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So, in fact, yes, in all of our systemic reviews, we do follow up 2 years after. So you heard me explaining the process for the 5-year review where we reviewed the 17 largest departments in terms of value and volume. So we're now in the process of following up on those. We issue a report card at the end evaluating whether in fact there was compliance with the recommendations. And it's a pretty easy tool to see. For ArriveCan, again, we don't anticipate doing anything different. So 2 years from the date of completion, we will follow up with all 3 departments and ensure that we are able to assess compliance of the recommendations.
You were just answering Ms. Vignola's question around the proactive disclosure, proactive information sharing, and you said that it was very difficult to find information on these contracts. Is it your sense that there's a somewhat nefarious practice to prevent transparency, or is this just incompetence and people not following the rules because it takes time and it costs money and they don't want to do it? What's going on here?
So I do know that there's a resourcing issue, right? So again, we would not be alone in saying that the need for resources is real in the procurement community. I can't speak to proactive disclosure specifically. I know Derek was leaning in, so I imagine he has something a little bit more intelligent to say than what I'm offering. But
20 seconds, we better shift to him.
Okay.
No, I would like to think it's a resourcing issue and training and development as opposed to anything else.
And this is at the department as opposed to on the part of the contractors?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Mr. Brock, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for your report. Thank you for your transparency on this extremely important issue. I want to just circle back a little bit. There's a couple of comments that you prefaced earlier today that this was...
The previous administration so far from the issue at hand.
What is your point of order, please?
I just want to know what the relevancy is here.
It's not a point of order, Mr. Kuzmierczak.
We're going on a tangent here.
Mr. Kuzmierczak, you know that's not a point of order. Mrs. Kusi, please continue.
The relevancy for Canadians that are watching is that we are in this committee. Government operations is seized consistently with getting the truth for Canadians. And again, we see members of the government trying to confuse Canadians with misfacts, misinformation here today specifically regarding the application saving lives and the use of the federal government under Prime Minister Harper using GC strategies, which was simply not the case. Now, Mr. Chair, with the remaining time that I have, I will continue on my questions. In your report, you state that 23 out of the 23 competitive contracts reviewed, you do not see instances where point-rated criteria unfairly restricted competition. We've now seen evidence that in other contracts, GC Strategies had manipulated their resources information in order to meet the point criterion. I think that's important because it's consistent with the bait and switch conversation that we've had throughout this meeting here today. So was this type of misconduct something that would have been covered within your review?
With respect to GC Strategies, I guess with the we're one of the larger. Sorry, I'm pausing here because I was thinking more about the matrix, as Kristen Firth called it at the committee here. It's the evaluation grid that they use for resources added through task authorization. And I guess one of the most egregious things we saw with these was the practice of copying and pasting the criteria as experience for the individuals with no additional information to show how they actually demonstrated that they met those requirements. And this was through I think I quote 16 of the 42 task authorizations on the GC Strategies contract. So that was rather troubling.
Thank you. I believe that's called plagiarism in most institutions. Continuing on that vein, it's mentioned that security clearances were switched on a contract because the CBSA wanted to work with a specific resource that did not fulfill the property security requirements. How often are departments able to simply lower security requirements to suit their own wants and needs over the security of Canadians? My other colleague had mentioned the national security exception, but here I'm referring specifically to the security clearances that were, and again, we're seeing the bait and switch, that were switched on a contract because the CBSA apparently wanted to work with a specific vendor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I should say that shouldn't happen, right? If the classification of security was accurate, then that shouldn't happen. And if there was an error and oversight, then I agree it should be corrected. So I'm not sure we can definitively say based on what we saw as to which category I would put it in, but I would agree with the characterization that it should not happen.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses.
Thanks. Mr. Kuzmarchuk, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I would say that begin by stating that the ArriveCan app was downloaded 60 million times in the year that it was in operation. It allowed commerce to continue, trade to continue, billions of dollars of trade across the Ambassador Bridge in my community. Goods, not only like parts for machines, for cars, but also medicine. That was absolutely important. And the ArriveCan app, which we heard around this table, testimony that without it, trade and the exchange of goods, vital goods, would have ground to a halt across the Ambassador Bridge. So I just wanted to take issue with the comment that was made by my counterpart across the way. Just a simple question for you, Mr. Yeglich. Did you find corruption in your analysis?
So what I can say is we found systemic non-compliance.
Okay, did you find corruption?
No.
Did you find fraud?
No.
You found non-compliance. Is that correct?
So what I will say is I do want to paint the fulsome picture. We found issues with documentation. Like I said, we cannot identify an actual source of why there is so much documentation missing, but there is certainly a high level of missing documentation. We had systemic non-compliance with contractual obligations. And then third, I would just say the public disclosures by whistleblowers. But again, that wasn't part of our review, right? That I'm talking about what was being disclosed simultaneously while the review was happening by witnesses and others talking on this topic.
How many contracts a year does PSPC and the Government of Canada enter into every year? I'm just curious, ballpark figure.
I think I heard one of the witnesses mention 10,000 transactions, but I think I'm outside of my level of knowledge, but I believe a witness did mention 10,000 was a figure.
And you talked about the fact that procurement is a very complex creature, would you say? Is it fair to say that governments, Canada and around the world, are always striving to evolve their procurement systems? There's always gaps that need to be filled. There's always issues where, again, with existing systems, there's always work that needs to be done to train workers, to make sure that they're compliant with the existing rules, and also to fill gaps. Is it fair to say that Canada's no different from other procurement systems in Canada or around the world on that score?
I would say there's certainly jurisdictions where procurement continues to be a difficulty in terms of advancing objectives. And I would describe that we've seen significant change in Canada over the last several years. But I also have to honestly say that if you look at certain reports that were issued even a decade ago about some of the problems that we see in procurement, they would still apply today. And so to me, that's indicative of, yes, there is absolutely positive change being made. But again, it's sometimes akin to changing the tires on a moving bus, for lack of a better expression. And so as a result, I will say, though, however, I do speak to procurement communities across all areas, so not just suppliers, but also Canadian government buyers. And I don't want to give the impression that these individuals across the government did not do fantastic work during the pandemic. That being said, that's not what we're here for. We're here for the report specifically and what we saw specifically with ArriveCan.
And again, I think you mentioned it today. The response that you got from the departments, did you get a sense that they were striving to improve the system, that they wanted to work with you and improve the system?
So what I will say is there was a previous mention to Appendix A, which was the document that CBSA provided. And I would say that it's obvious from that document that they're taking the recommendations very seriously, which, again, from our perspective is what we want to see. There's no point in undertaking these reviews if the recommendations aren't taken seriously. But from public statements made and the annex that we were able to append, I would certainly say that it appears that they're taking the recommendations very seriously.
Now, these protocols, these systems that exist, they didn't just emerge last year or the year before or 5 years ago. I think you alluded to it. They've been around for a while. A lot of these systems date back to 15, 20 years, previous governments. Is that a fair assessment that some of the gaps, some of the shortcomings can be traced back, not just years, but even decades? I mean, this is a complex system that evolves.
Very quick answer, please.
Is that correct?
I would simply say that it's a very slow evolution, so, yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks. Mrs. Vignola for 2.5, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Now, studying ArriveCan, reviewing McKinsey, requires a good, solid team and a lot of efforts on your part. Now, in your opinion, do you find your terms of reference broad enough to properly review and study this kind of contract? And if not, what should be added to your review?
The question, giving me the opportunity to speak on this again, but I think I mentioned it earlier, is the right to compel documentation. We don't currently have that, and I see that as a shortcoming because I think it's an example of an opportunity to improve our mandate. There are other examples that we've made, not specific necessarily to procurement practice reviews, which is the question you asked me, but there are certainly additional tools. And like I said, financially, we were given sufficient funding to pursue McKinsey and ArriveCan, absolutely. But as I mentioned before, it's the funding going forward that we need in order to continue to pursue. So we need the resources. Again, I'll just say we have a fantastic team. Thank you for mentioning, the diligence in the report. And I know that they're very proud of the product. And so I appreciate the positive feedback that we've received about the diligence of the report.
Now, what I like, and I'll take a little bit less time because I used up so much earlier, what I like about your report is it is clear, it's not complacent, you say what you have to say, and a fairly reasonable number of pages. There aren't 3,000 pages to read, and I like that fact because I always go over things with a fine-tooth comb. Thank you very much for your work, for your answers. and it will be a pleasure to ask you questions in the future should that time come.
Thank you, Mrs. Vignola, for turning back some time to us. Mr. Bachrach, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you to both gentlemen for your time here this evening and your work on this important report. The last issue I wanted to raise is this situation that you've documented whereby proponents are essentially taking the mandatory criteria in the procurement documents, copying it, and then pasting it to reflect their own expertise and experience. And I'm curious as to, I'm familiar with this in some hiring processes too, where there are certain keywords that the employer is looking for in the job interview, and as long as you say those keywords, it doesn't even matter what order they're in. They tick a box, and then the empirical score goes up, and you have a greater chance of getting hired. How did the empirical rating process that you looked into treat this like really blatant gaming of the system here?
So the document itself specifically says that one cannot demonstrate experience by simply restating, and it gives the example, and yet that's exactly what was done and ultimately accepted.
So in those cases, obviously there's a score associated with those responses, even though the responses, as you've indicated, weren't allowed at all. How did they end up scoring when they did that copy and paste exercise?
Actually, it's interesting. I'll separate the two sides. The process when they put forward resources or individuals as part of the bid to win the contract, there seems to be much more rigor around the evaluation, the assessment of those resources at that phase. Where the issues that we really identified come up is at the task authorization phase after they've already been awarded the contract. And the way the system is designed, it's actually the vendor who completes the grid that's used to evaluate them, and they actually provide the scores, which are then signed off by the department. But
I've always found that I do the best on exams when I mark them myself. It's funny how that works, you know? Yeah, it's just astonishing. Maybe I'll leave my questioning on that note, Mr. Chair, and thank our witnesses again for their time this evening.
Well, thank you for turning over a few minutes time, Mr. Bachrach, and for the humor. Mr. Genuis, please go ahead for 5.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you again to the witnesses. This really is some of the craziest stuff we've ever heard at this committee, and that's saying something because we've heard some pretty wild things at this committee. I do want to say you were asked questions by Mr. Kuzmerichuk about corruption. Obviously, you're not prosecutors or police officers, but I think it's pretty clear that activities like doctoring resumes in order to get contracts would constitute fraud, would constitute criminal activity, and would definitely constitute corruption. And it's interesting that Liberals want to weasel out of that, but I won't press you on that point because I understand it's not your area of expertise. I wanted to ask about the so-called experience criteria. The way the system is structured, as you describe it, is that people who bid for many of these contracts have to have done work for the government of Canada before. So you might have a better product, you might have more experience working with other clients, other governments, other private sector clients, but if you don't have the direct experience working for the federal government, then you get cut out on that basis. So this means that you have a system where you have to be an insider to get the work. The same insider contractors get recycled over and over again by virtue of the fact that the rules specifically require you to be an insider. And this severely narrows the band of who can bid to specific existing insider companies. Again, how is this remotely defensible?
So I think you're referring to the section that speaks to mandatory criteria and how it would be next to impossible for any other bidder to meet those criteria. So again, it's a very disappointing outcome because when you run a competitive process, you're telling the universe that you want the best outcome and you want competition. But yet you structure the mandatory criteria in a way that essentially eliminates the competitive aspect. So to answer your question, does it make sense? It does not make sense.
Right. Yeah. So hypothetically, you have a company based in the Maritimes that has done extensive IT work for the 4 provinces on the East Coast, as well as let's say for some states in the northeast of the U.S., they see a contract for the federal government that seems like a good fit, and based on this criteria, they can't bid at all, even though they've done IT work for other governments, just because they don't have that federal government experience. This seems like a system designed to protect insiders and exclude outsiders, so that those insiders can charge higher prices and continue to get the same jobs over and over again, regardless of quality.
So it is something that, it's not a requirement in all solicitations that one have previous government experience. That being said, it often is one of the characteristics that's used in mandatory criteria to diminish the field of eligible options, right? So when we see that, it often draws our attention in noting that it's a restrictive criteria, and then there has to be a justification, and that's the other side, right? When you develop these mandatory criteria, you need to be able to justify why they are so essential to delivering on the ultimate outcome. And in many instances, there might be justifiable reasons, but when you couple everything together, it's impossible to meet all of those characteristics and still have an open, fair, and competition.
Right, thank you. I think the last thing you said, let's underline. If you take all those pieces together, it's impossible to have a fair and open competition. You've put together this excellent report. I'm not as familiar with the processes of your office, so I just want to understand this. Is there some process by which the government will be required to provide a written response to your recommendations?
So the response to the recommendations is actually embedded in the report, so you'll see that, and that's actually part of the process. But I will say that we also do follow up. So 2 years from the date of finalization of the report, we will commence the process of actually assessing compliance with the recommendations.
Okay, so you'll have a follow-up process to assess compliance. Did the government accept all of your recommendations?
Yes, they did.
Okay, so they're saying they've accepted them. We'll have a chance to see whether they actually follow through on them later on. Now, if I can just again circle back quickly to the issue of the missing records. You have no way of knowing why those records are missing. It could be because somebody deleted those records. It could be because they were never submitted. It could be because conversations happened in an informal setting or over the phone that should have happened in another way. Your report highlights the fact that as part of the ArriveCan procurement, there seems a bizarre pattern of missing records. You don't know why that is, but you're underlining the fact that this is strange and unusual. Is that fair?
It is fair, but what I will also say is what we have heard is that it's a very pandemic-specific issue. So you went from an environment where almost all records were paper to an environment where it was impossible. Everyone was working remotely, and as a result, there were no record-keeping practices. That being said, I think people understand that they still have an obligation to keep accurate records, whether they're working remotely or in an office taking them on physical paper. So while I have heard that explanation and I'm understanding of that explanation, it doesn't dilute the fact that you still have to have appropriate record-keeping safeguards to ensure exactly what we've seen does not occur.
There would have been emails. There would have been some kind of back and forth, surely.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Jouari, to finish off, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for those Canadians who are watching us today, just wanted to make sure that I clarified the statement that my colleague P.S. Charles Sousa made. I think the reference that P.S. Charles Sousa made was to Mr. Christian Furt having gone back previous government and receiving contracts, not GC strategy. Now, having said that, let's go back to one thing that you brought up, Mr. Jiglek. You brought up the concept of best value, and you broke it down to two categories, one technical and the other one financial or dollar value. You also, in your testimony, you talked about that there seems to be a rigorous process at the earliest stages of the evaluation, but somehow that process we run into a lot of systematic non-compliance when it comes to the task authorization, where at that point we are locking the resources. So if that's the case, what skill set, who actually verifies, which body actually verifies before the task authorization is done? Is it the department or is it the PSPC?
So in this instance, you'll see in one of the recommendations, it was CBSA that was confirming all of the task authorizations, but I think I'll let Derek speak because I know this is something he specifically looked at.
Yeah, so at the task authorization stage, it is the client department. In these cases, it's CBSA. And those are signed by a single individual who accepts the evaluation grid that was submitted by the vendor.
One of your recommendation, I assume, is that PSPC plays a bigger role and a more prominent role during task authorization and do evaluation. And if that valuation is going to be based on technical and financial, what kind of skill set and what kind of resourcing do we have to complement the PSPC with to be able to do that technical assessment and be able to have that secondary eye on, well, okay, you're replacing this resource. Yes, I understand the circumstances. Or, well, no, if you're replacing these resources, the prices should be adjusted as well. Can you comment on that?
So you'll notice in the 12th recommendation, we say that PSPC should retract the authority of CBSA to issue TAs for contracts awarded by PSPC until such time that CBSA has consistently demonstrated compliance with all requirements of the tasking process. So now CBSA is incentivized to behave in accordance with the rules. And so they will not have that authority, and that recommendation was also accepted. So it provides an additional oversight. So PSPC has a level of expertise that
I got that. So does PSPC today have that level of expertise to be able to assess at the time of task authorization the technical as well as the value for money?
Right. So I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of PSPC to answer that question, but it's surely a question you can ask them.
Okay. No, follow up on that one. Naturally, a lot of guidelines are developed by TBS. And did you take it one step further and see whether those guidelines existed by TBS?
So in the actual contract itself, there is instructions as to how this process is to unfold. So I don't think it's for lack of clarity in terms of how the process should work. I think, again, I don't want to provide too much in terms of the emergency component of this, but certainly that was a rationale provided to us as to why some of these things were happening. But I don't think on this issue it's a lack of clarity.
Yeah, and I don't want to trigger another one-year project, but it would be in your experience so far. Have you seen this, what you say, systematic non-compliance as it relates to this contract and this application anywhere else when it came to PSPC working with other departments as a secondary set of eyes when the task authorization was being drafted?
So because we haven't looked specifically at task authorizations, I don't have any specific data set. And that's, the beauty of our 5-year review is it did give us static baseline data, so we can now know, what the expectations are in the areas we've looked at. So I did mention previously that this has given us, obviously, a pause as to whether this is something we should pursue in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Gentlemen, thank you for staying late. I sincerely appreciate it.